Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning to everybody and a very warm welcome to IPI and to the first annual Women, Peace and Leadership Symposium on the topic of advancing women's roles and rights amid global challenges. I am very, very pleased to organize this event series in partnership with Ann and the government of Sweden. So I'm very happy today to announce that the symposium on women, peace and leadership in cooperation with the government of Sweden will be held each September here at IPI during the high-level event of the General Assembly. This series of meetings every September will focus on the important role that gender plays in peace and security. For the inaugural symposium, we are very honored to have with us this morning a very distinguished panel, including Ann, which of course is Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, Gemayes of Tunisia, Foreign Minister, who is about to arrive. I think he hasn't arrived yet, but I think he's on his way. And then Grace, who is Minister for International Relations and Cooperation in the Republic of South Africa, and Asma, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Sudan, and Rosemary, as we all know, who is the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs at the UN. And Kavia, who is the Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. In the papers which I think you have, or at least I hope you have, you will find bios of all the panelists. For 2 decades, policy frameworks have been built to embed a gender perspective in peace and security efforts through what we know as Women, Peace and Security Agenda. However, the commitments to gender equality is under threat globally. This includes efforts to prevent and to end conflict. In some ways, the level of gender equality can be a litmus test of a community's capacity to avoid violent responses to threats. Women's leadership and women's status and participation are intimately linked with conflict prevention and with conflict resolution. Mediators and negotiators in conflict resolution processes are unfortunately rarely women, and women's rights are insufficiently reflected in agreements. In a multilateral system, established standards of women's rights are being questioned as being too weak by a growing number of states. Recently, we've seen women face exclusion when they attempt to have their voices heard in discussions that determine the future of their communities. Today, here at IPI this morning, is an important opportunity for us to reflect on these issues, and I hope the conversation will focus on ways to reaffirm our commitment to inclusion and women's rights. It is indeed an opportunity to look at what can be done to enhance existing efforts and, hopefully, creative initiatives to do more should be discussed. As we prepare to mark the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, I look forward to hearing the insights of the panelists, and I'm sure there will be a dynamic discussion with all participants this morning. I will now turn the floor over to the Vice President of IPR, Adam Lupel. Adam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, everyone. So happy to see such a crowded room. It is a genuine privilege to chair this morning's event and this critical and truly timely topic, in particular to do so with the government of Sweden. Sweden, as everyone in this room knows, has shown great leadership on this topic, being the first country in the world to publicly adopt a feminist foreign policy in 2014, putting the promotion of gender equality and women's rights at the center of its diplomatic agenda. And so I am really proud to be launching this event with Sweden here this morning, and we look forward to doing this on an annual basis, and that, I believe, is a reflection of our sustained commitment to this topic. And on that, I'd like to also acknowledge the lead of this work at IPI, Sarah Taylor, who is somewhere in the room. There she is. Thank you, Sarah, for your great work on this for IPI. For the agenda today, as the international community prepares to mark the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325, we have asked our panelists a series of questions to provide us with their views on the following. What are the components of a robust agenda for the international community on women, peace, and security after the 2020 anniversary? What are the biggest barriers to realizing that robust agenda? And then what is your key message to the leaders gathered in New York this week and more broadly to overcome those challenges? We have a lot to discuss. We are very fortunate to have such a distinguished panel here with us today, and it is now my great pleasure to invite Ann Linde, Foreign Minister of Sweden, to deliver the first remarks. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here and co-host this important event together with IPI. And I'm also looking forward to listen to all the other panelists with your insights. As a Minister for Foreign Trade, which I was before I became Minister for Foreign Affairs 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, I actually launched a feminist trade policy. And I'm also a proud member of the feminist government, and I will continue to take the feminist foreign policy forward, not least the women, peace and security agenda. I recognize that important progress has been made already, and I want to acknowledge the important efforts and contribution by many of you in this room. During our term at the UN Security Council, working with other members, we managed to ensure that women, peace and security perspective was integrating in all country-specific files and mandates. We are now working to ensure that the attention to these issues is maintained and that agreed mandates are implemented on the ground where it matters, and with the capacity and resources that are needed. At the same time, I am concerned that we have not been able to make even more headway. The international community is still failing to fully implement the commitments we have made. We are still failing the women who suffer from consequences of war, including victims of conflict-related sexual violence. We cannot rest until women are on top of the agenda in all the prevention and peace-building efforts in conflict-affected countries. Because women are always the first to suffer in conflicts. Yet, women are rarely invited to meetings that matter. Even when women are at the forefront of the movements of change, they do not get to sit in the room where the future is decided. In this regard, I welcome the statement from the new Sudanese Prime Minister Hamdok, as he pointed to the low representation of women in the negotiation that preceded the establishment of the civil administration in August. Prime Minister Hamdok has followed up on his commitment, appointing women in prominent positions. So I'm very happy to have the chance to hear directly from Her Excellency Abdallah today on how Sudan works to encourage women's engagement and what we can do to support you in your endeavor. A high-level Swedish delegation visited Sudan last week to assess how we can best support the reform agenda, including to promote women's participation. Mr. Chair, in view of the 2020 commemorations, the international community will no doubt commit to certain investments and activities. Individual leaders will continue to play important roles, but we also need institutions to take their responsibility. International, regional, national, and local institutions must step up and take the agenda forward. In concrete terms, this could, for example, include quotas for women's representation in decision-making bodies, having criteria for women in negotiation, investment in gender advisors, inclusion of a gender perspective in conflict analysis, and prevention of sexual and gender-based violence by reaching out to men, and also making sure perpetrators are prosecuted. Colleagues, we are already lagging behind. There is no room for further hesitation. The time to take action is now. As the new Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden, I will play an active role in this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for getting us off to a great start. And again, thank you for your leadership on this topic. We will now hear from the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa, Grace Pandor. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this meeting. I always feel quite embarrassed to talk about women and peace. Being a South African, a country in which the women are, in a sense, at war because of men, with very high levels of rape and femicide in our country. It's a battle that we are having to wage, and we do so through working very closely with women in organizations of civil society, through directly engaging men and trying to change their patriarchal attitudes toward women. But it is a massive fight that we have to change our society from one ridden by violence into one in which the rights of all persons, particularly women, are fully honored and respected. We also have a very robust program of support for training in mediation and conflict resolution for women from all over the SADC region and countries beyond SADC. This program has involved thousands of women working in communities on conflict resolution and peace building. What we have found is that while there is this crop of women who now have these very, very important skills, whenever there is a conflict, they're never included in a peace-building process. And we have agreed with them at the last meeting that one of the things we want to do is to encourage the Secretary General and various structures of peace and security in multilateral bodies to have a database of women who have these skills, and to ensure that whenever there are processes intended to resolve conflicts and arrive at peace, that these women are utilized. We are very concerned that in conflict situations where women and children are the primary victims, women are not involved in the peace processes. You don't see many women envoys, for example, at a very high level. And we believe that the victims must become part of those who resolve the problem. However, we also hold the view that the participation of women should not just be in getting to a point of settlement or peace. We believe women must get training in constitution making, in the formation of public institutions, and in the maintenance of democracy, so that they don't become marginal post the conflict, which often happens when there are massive demonstrations or mass mobilization. You will see women in the vanguard, but the minute you sit at the table to determine the nature of the final settlement, women are missing. And there may be one or two, but in the main, it's not a gender-friendly process. So we are incorporating into our training elements of post-conflict skills that women need. The character of the parliament, participation in electoral processes, ensuring women are candidates and that they're able to mount electoral campaigns, that they get into governance, and that when they do so, they shape a system of governance that fully accommodates and includes attention to human dignity and equality. If women cannot do those very basic things, then they will remain at the margins post the conflict. So our interest very deeply in the work that we're doing is to ensure that we move women with them into the center and not have them remain at the margins. We believe that's very, very vital. South Africa is working very hard on the renewal of Resolution 1325, which 20 years ago was a radical resolution that put the issues of women, peace, and security at the center of the UN peace agenda. We believe over the 2 decades, there are experiences that we have garnered, given the range of conflicts that have occurred over these 2 decades, and that Resolution 35 requires us to refresh it, to modernize it so that it continues to be relevant. And so we will, as we take up our non-permanent role in the UN Security Council, because there's no African country that is permanent in the UN Security Council, despite the large number of African countries that are members. So we will use our non-permanent role in order to argue for a revived 1325 resolution and ensure that we renew the UN member states' commitment to the core obligations that lie within that resolution. We firmly believe that we should stop adopting resolutions and not having follow-up. We should stop having commitments that are not followed by action. We therefore hope that we should adopt a renewed resolution and that we should ensure that arising from it, the contribution, the participation, the recognition, the inclusion of women in defining peace and security will be fundamentally altered. We must ensure that women are part of society's definition of a human agenda. And I think actually the fact that we discuss women as distinct from every other person is a peculiarity that needs to end. We are part of humanity, and everything that happens in every society must include us, because we're not marginal, we're not an instance, we are part of society. And so I think even as we support all the various programs that our countries invest in, we should ensure that if women are not at the center, we don't provide the support, that we withdraw it until things are done with a full recognition of the equality of every person. So we will work hard in South Africa to fight against the sexual violence that women experience in our country. We're going to tighten up our legislation and ensure that those who commit these acts will land in prison for a very long time. So there's a great deal that our country has to do. Please excuse me, we talk a lot at the United Nations. I'm a new Minister of International Relations, and I've discovered people talk a lot, but there doesn't appear to be much action. And I'm an action-oriented person. I believe that we must find ways of working together so that the wonderful role of women and their capacity for peace and development begins to play a role in changing the world. Because there are no women who start wars. It is men who cause much of the conflict that we see in the world. So we would like to see women taking leadership because we believe that their orientation is toward peace and development. And South Africa is committed to fully supporting the development of that orientation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for showing us that your action-oriented approach, sharing the experience of South Africa, and giving us a little bit of a preview of some upcoming initiatives. We really look forward to having you here in New York on the Council. It is my pleasure to turn the floor now to Asma Mohammed Abdallah, who just early this month became Sudan's first female Minister of Foreign Affairs. Congratulations. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is my first exposure as a foreign minister, and I hope I'll be able to give a true picture of what's happening in my country now. But before that, I'd like to take you a little bit to our history, where participation of women in all the affairs of the country are really noted. Of course, we have since the early Nubian kingdoms, we have the Kandaka, who is the mother or the queen, who really takes part in peacemaking. And then we have the Hakama in Western Sudan. They are kind of women poets, and they are always calling for peace. So this indicates that in our past, women were good participants in governance. I'm going to go from here to the implementation of Resolution 1325. We have made some progress in implementation of this resolution. We have a comprehensive plan, and we have national institutions with civil society participation and strong campaigns, for example, to end FGM, which is a violent action against women. We have a national strategy for combating violence against women. This adopted a program for the years 2018 to 2032. And there are units established under this since 2005. Also, in compliance with this resolution, a Women's Center for Peace was established, and this mainly deals with building capacities in the field of negotiations and social dialogue. In implementing the resolution, we have met some challenges in that, and one of them is the limited engagement of men in the implementation of the resolution. And this poses some key obstacles which hinder the recognition of the values embedded in the resolution. The other difficulty or the other challenge is that it's always a matter of capacity building for individuals and institutions, and awareness raising on the issues of women in peace and women rights and empowerment. Also, the atmosphere, the political atmosphere, is not encouraging, to implement this resolution at that time. I mean, then capacity building programs are really limited in this area, and the ones which are available are on negotiations and peace building. So we need to enhance this. We need to enhance the role of the media in raising awareness about the resolution and its positive effect. After the dramatic change which took place in Sudan and the positive participation of women in the uprising and all the activities that followed, as my colleague said, women's presence in the field, you mean participating in the demonstrations and taking place in all the action which took place at that time, is greater than their participation when they sat down for negotiations. Yani it's far less than what is actually happening in the field. Of course, this has been dealt with in the constitutional document for the transitional period, which was signed into August 2019, which includes items to raise awareness on women's rights and promote women's rights in Sudan in all aspects, social, political, and economic, like equal pay for equal work and some other aspects, and then combating all types of discrimination against women. And then it's also stated in this document that women's participation in the legislative transitional legislative council should not be less than 40%, if not more. I think this is a very positive progress made regarding the participation of women, and in a way, it's a gesture. I think it's just to try to remedy the situation, but we still have so much to do in this respect. As you heard from my colleague, the minister here, our prime minister have real interest in women's rights and women empowerment, and one of the directives about this is to work on what he called positive empowerment of women in all ministries. And I think this has been very clear, and I think this directive will be followed to the word. Again, there are some issues which are given priority, like violence against women, and in this respect, we have established the family and child units, which have been working for some time, and they were dealing with family protection, dealing with early marriages, dealing with sexual violence, dealing with FGM. So all these issues have been dealt with within these units, and I think there is some progress made to that in this respect. Regionally, Sudan has agreed to all the protocols, I think, except CEDAW, but we are working on that. The Minister of Justice, they have been preparing, to ratify CEDAW, and I hope they're going to do this soon as possible. I think, in a nutshell, This is what has been going on in Sudan, and we are only starting, after 30 years of stagnation, or even going back, and on so many issues. I think our role is, to try to remedy and do whatever we can, and then build on that to improve the situation of women, whether they are in the cities or in the rural areas. And there is also special care will be given to women in areas of conflict, women and children in areas of conflict. And this is dealt with now within the issue of conflict resolution. I think I'm going to stop here, and I hope in a future forum we'll be able to give some concrete examples on how we manage to go in this respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your extraordinary and genuinely inspiring experience from Sudan. We will now hear from Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, United Nations, who is also a trailblazer in her own right, being the first woman to lead the UN political department. So, Madam, you have the floor.
Sort of like being the first man on the moon or something. First, let me just thank you, IPI, for organizing today's event. It's really an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be with my female ministers who are so distinguished. Obviously, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has grown progressively over the last 20 years. It's had a profound cultural change on the United Nations. Gender issues, gender equality, now mainstreamed into all our peace missions. We have women's civil society representatives regularly briefing the Security Council on country developments. But this work hasn't been easy, and it is nowhere near complete. Many have spoken about the global backlash against women's rights. It threatens the gains we've already made, and it certainly impedes us from moving forward. Just this year at the UN, we've seen targeted cyberbullying of the chair of the Commission on the Status of Women, and for the very first time, loss of consensus on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda during the Security Council open debate on conflict-related sexual violence in April. We see that women's share of seats in Parliament globally is stuck at 24%, and women voters continue to be 4 times as likely as men to be targeted for intimidation during elections. These experiences mirror some of the challenges that my department faces in promoting women's rights in conflict prevention, peacemaking, and peace building. I'll give you an example. In Colombia, where the peace agreement has been a stellar example of gender-sensitive language and provisions, women peace builders and activists are being targeted today. The number of ceasefire or peace agreements with gender-related provisions has fallen despite our best efforts. And even with strong advocacy from UN mediators, conflict parties continue to resist the inclusion of women in their delegations. Now, in the face of such resistance, what's needed? Well, first of all, strong leadership and political will. And I'm committed to doing my part to advance this agenda. I've issued a new Women, Peace, and Security policy for my department and for our field missions. This is for our special representatives and envoys in the field. The policy aims to ensure that women's meaningful participation and gender-sensitive analysis are integrated into all our work, and that all staff recognize that this agenda is a personal responsibility. This includes, of course, the senior leaders, as I said. Along with many other senior leaders at the United Nations, I've pledged to meet with women's groups whenever I travel. I recently visited Afghanistan along with Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. and the executive directors of UN Women and UNFPA. We intend to make visits to other countries as well. We saw how much progress has been made in Afghanistan by women over the last 18 years, and progress that they do not want to lose. And we are committed to ensure their involvement in any intra-Afghan peace negotiations. These negotiations must be inclusive in order to receive UN support. Now, we have other issues that we're dealing with now where we really need to ensure that women are adequately represented. In Syria, we'll be establishing a constitutional committee. It was just announced a couple of days ago. This has potential to be the first inclusive decision-making body in a political process after many years of fighting. We want to ensure that women are represented, and we have ensured that the civil society component of the Constitutional Committee includes a significant number of women. We're rolling out a project in the Great Lakes region to promote meaningful participation of women in political life. More broadly, our missions are involved in providing support to women peacemakers, not only Colombia, Afghanistan, Great Lakes, but also in Iraq, in Libya, Guinea-Bissau, Somalia, and Sudan. And we're engaging very actively with the ever-growing network of women mediators. And I'm pleased to recognize that the global alliance of these networks will be launched tomorrow. But of course, the UN Secretariat cannot drive this agenda on our own. We look to partnerships with member states and civil society, and that's why you are so important, those of you sitting here today. I'd ask member states in particular to take some concrete steps going forward. First of all, nominating, appointing, and electing more women to leadership positions and decision-making roles. I think you all know of the Secretary General's gender parity policy. We've now reached 47% female participation in senior leadership at the United Nations, both at headquarters and in the field. And he's committed to taking that over 50%. Also ask that member states, civil society advocates, advocate for women's rights and gender equality in public statements, and critically in closed-door engagements. Systematically engage and support women's groups in your own countries, including by providing concrete financial and logistical support for their work. And finally, by mainstreaming gender equality and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda as a foreign policy priority. And thank you to the government of Sweden for doing this. Last, I just want to say that I'm in complete agreement with the Minister of South Africa. What we need is implementation. We have many resolutions. We've had many discussions. We need to walk the talk. We need to ensure that these resolutions are implemented. And so I credit very much the mission of South Africa for taking this forward during their presidency of the Security Council this month to focus truly on the implementation of what we've already agreed to. And I can assure you that the United Nations will be there to work with you on this critically important agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, for sharing the extensive work coming out of the Secretariat on this issue, as well as including some concrete recommendations. We will now hear from Kavya Asoka, Executive Director, NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. Kavya, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you to IPI and to Sweden for co-hosting this forum, and it's a real pleasure to share the podium with all of you. Thank you for your statements. The NGO Working Group is a coalition of 19 international organizations who work with women in over 50 countries around the world. Members of our coalition, many of whom are in this room, originally advocated for the passage of 1325. We believe that the principle of women's agency lies at the heart of this agenda. And our core mandate is to advocate for women's meaningful participation in all aspects of peace and security. So when we are asked what the components of a robust agenda are, you won't be surprised when I tell you that number one on my list is women's direct, equal, and meaningful participation in all aspects of peace, and that this must be non-negotiable and safeguarded as a right. We've heard about how nearly 20 years since the adoption of Resolution 1325, despite the fact that conflicts have a disproportional impact on the health, safety, and rights of women, that they are continuously shut out of decision-making processes. We know that the majority of peace agreements don't include provisions on women, girls, or gender. In 2018, none of the 3 UN-led ceasefire or peace agreements mentioned gender or women. A striking real-world example of this is women's exclusion in Yemen. At the talks in Stockholm last year, both of the warring parties refused the presence of the Women's Advisory Group. The resulting Stockholm Agreement has no gender provisions, no references to either how women's rights were violated during the conflict or why they would be important for contributing to future processes. This is in the context of a conflict that is clearly gendered. 5 months into the armed conflict, gender-based violence increased by 70%. 76% of internally displaced people are women and children. Child marriage increased by 66%. I mention these statistics mainly to highlight how gender is such a fundamental part of understanding the impact of this conflict. And there's a gender dimension to every conflict. And so the fact that women were excluded should be unacceptable. There are many other examples of women's exclusion from peace processes or where women's rights are viewed as dispensable or secondary to achieving peace. The second component of a robust agenda, defending the legitimacy of the work of all human rights defenders. We know that there is today greater repression of women human rights defenders than ever before, that women are facing unprecedented levels of political violence, and that protests around women's rights are more violently repressed than other kinds of protests. The Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders in March of this year found that the rise in misogynistic, sexist, and homophobic speech by prominent political leaders in recent years is normalizing violence against women and gender non-conforming persons. These global trends are irrefutable evidence that women are facing retaliation for engaging in political life, for peacefully protesting, for advocating for human rights, and for better policies. As long as ordinary women, human rights defenders, political leaders, political candidates are the targets of violence and harassment, they cannot participate freely in public life. Libya is an example. Just a few weeks ago, we supported a civil society briefer to the Security Council who described what the effects of the assassination of women's rights advocate Salva Bugages in 2014, as well as the recent abduction of parliamentarian Seham Sergewa, has been on Libyan civil society. She told the Security Council that the threat of reprisals and retaliation for participating in politics, for speaking out, or for carrying out human rights work, combined with a lack of accountability or specific steps by the government to address these risks, has effectively forced women out of public life. Women human rights defenders are not just essential in the fight for gender equality, but for human rights and for peace. If you, the UN member states, don't speak out regularly and publicly to condemn attacks against them, if you don't take action to protect them, you are undermining global efforts to end conflict. This brings me to the third component of a robust agenda. Recognition that gender equality and the human rights of women, girls, and gender non-conforming people are central to the maintenance of international peace and security. As we've heard from many on the panel today, and as we know from reading the news, we are witnessing increasing and direct attacks on women's rights and attacks on core international human rights norms, including the right to sexual and reproductive health and on sexual orientation and gender identity by a variety of actors around the world, as well as within the very UN mechanisms tasked with protecting human rights and ensuring peace and security. It bears repeating. Comprehensive reproductive health services, including abortion, are necessary to guarantee the right to life, to health, to non-discrimination for women and girls. Without these rights, women cannot participate fully or meaningfully in peace processes, in conflict resolution, or peace-building efforts. This undermines all pillars of the agenda. Given the global rise of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, it is critical that all of you in this room speak out publicly against any attempts at undermining international human rights standards of women and girls, of LGBTQI people, and strongly signal that such attacks are unacceptable. So in considering what the barriers are to realizing this robust agenda and what my key messages are to you today. The first, the WPS agenda must be grounded in gender equality and human rights, and it is essential that these are seen as fundamental, non-negotiable part of the WPS agenda. Not something that's optional, not something that's nice to have, and not something that can be selectively applied, but a vital component of peace and security. It means recognizing that gender equality is critical for conflict prevention, and understanding that the exclusion of women from peace agreements actively undermines peace. We urge all of you, the UN, member states, Security Council members, not to legitimize peace processes that do not include women, and to actively support an environment in which women can participate fully and freely without fear of reprisals. If WPS is not seen as fundamental to responding to conflict and crises, and if there is no accountability for failure to implement it, we know that women's rights will be traded away. There must be greater accountability and responsibility of senior UN officials for WPS to ensure that the UN consistently upholds these standards. But, as USG DiCarlo also mentioned, it is not just the UN's responsibility. It is you, states, who are members of the UN, who must speak up and apply that pressure. We look to you all to collectively defend the fundamental tenets of the agenda, including the full scope of women's rights, and push for full, not selective implementation. You can't advance the parts of the agenda that are easiest to implement or that align with your national interest. You can't pick and choose. It's all or it's nothing. True commitment to WPS requires going beyond symbolic gestures and technocratic solutions. It requires measurable impact on the ground, and the only credible benchmark of meaningful implementation is positive change in the lives of conflict-affected communities. Finally, we urge you to shift from crisis response to prevention, one of the foundational demands of women's movements who advocated for 1325. Prevention of conflict and sustaining peace are not simply matters of ending war and violence, but addressing the root causes of conflict. This includes gender inequality, but also military expenditure, arms proliferation, and emerging threats to peace and security like climate change. The transformative call of the anti-war feminists who pioneered this movement was to end war, not to make it safer for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavya. I think that really answers the question head-on of what a robust WPS agenda entails. So now we've got about a half an hour, 25 minutes for a Q&A. We do have a hard stop at 9:30. I've already begun a list of people who have asked to take the floor during the discussion period. We've had interference from all the security in the area, so we're not going to do wireless mics. We've got a podium here and also one in the back for Q&A. And actually first on my list is Ambassador Jackie O'Neill, Canada's first ambassador for women, peace, and security. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have a question. And first, I really want to thank you all for a very clear-eyed assessment and set of recommendations, and especially to hear from you, Minister Abdullah, about Sudan's future and using this really transformational time to create a government that truly reflects the people of Sudan is exciting. And I know I speak for all of us in saying we're with you and we're here to support you on that. So really briefly, as you mentioned, I'm Canada's new ambassador for women, peace, and security. And my question relates to how some of you are managing a challenge and an issue that we're dealing with in Canada right now. So our second National Action Plan is very much emblematic of what I think many countries are dealing with or managing, in that national action plans, I think, used to have two very diverse types. One type was externally focused entirely, primarily of donor countries, and one type was primarily of conflict-affected countries who had it and focused primarily on domestic challenges. And over the last 5-ish plus years, we've seen a real coming together of those types. So countries that had peacekeeping missions are now sending troops abroad. Countries like Canada are looking at our entire security forces, et cetera. And our National Action Plan, for example, has 9 signatory departments, including many that focus domestically, including our department that manages relationships with Indigenous communities. And part of our National Reconciliation Project and initiative is to ensure that we are engaging with Indigenous women on all aspects, including women, peace, and security. So I'm wondering if you can speak to your experiences of broadening the mandate across the government much more broadly and narrating its relevance and getting buy-in from communities working on trade and other areas, but including on ones that are focused domestically within countries that have not necessarily viewed women, peace, and security as part of their internal priorities. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. If you don't mind, we're going to collect a few questions before we come back to the panel, if that's okay. I have on my list Victoria Malaka of the African Union Commission. Yes? Yeah? Please.
Alrighty, good morning. Thank you so very much. I'm Victoria Maloka, the Acting Director for the Women, Gender and Development Directorate at the African Union Commission. I'm representing Mayor Binta Diop, the AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, who apologizes for not being able to attend the meeting today, but she requested me to really congratulate IPI and the government of Sweden on her behalf for hosting this very important meeting on the eve of the 20th anniversary of UNSCR 1325, and also requested that I convey the message of the chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, that the AU is very committed to gender equality and women's empowerment and to ensuring that women are part and parcel of all the mechanisms for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts, and that women also take leadership in peace processes and that they take leadership in all forms of post-conflict reconstruction. We have at the AUC adopted a number of progressive instruments to ensure that women participate equally and that their rights are fully protected, and to manage that concern that has already been raised around the difference between norm setting and implementation. We have the Continental Results Framework on Women, Peace and Security that assists us to track implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the continent. We also have, at a national level, we supported a number of member states to develop their national action plans on 1325. We have 25 thus far out of 55, and we are hoping that the Continental Results Framework will indeed assist us in making sure that we close the gap between the policies and their implementation, and to make sure that there are there's concrete action that is taken. We have a number of mechanisms that we have also established to ensure women's meaningful participation in leadership and peace and security. Many of you may already be aware of the Network of African Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, FEMWAS Africa, and of course the African Women Leaders Network, which harnesses the wealth of African women's experiences of leadership. A number of panelists have already identified some challenges, and we'll just make mention of just a few. Of course, sexual and gender-based violence is still a big concern for the African Union, and we are encouraging member states to put in place proper and very strong infrastructure for comprehensive responses to issues of sexual and gender-based violence with a survivor-centered approach. We also really need to ensure that there's proper funding and stronger national ownership of the gender equality and women and peace and security agenda. Many women have come to us to say, we really would love to do the work, but unfortunately, there isn't any support. And lastly, there's a really need for women's movements at community level to be supported. We are seeing that at the AUC that there's a little bit of a dwindling over the years in this regard, and we are hoping that as we determine the next priorities of our UNSCR 1325, we will look at some of these issues that we have raised. Thank you so very much.
Next on my list, I have from the European Union, Ms. Mara Marinaki, EU Special Advisor for Gender Equality.
Thank you very much. Great thanks to IPI for organizing this excellent discussion. Our special thanks and appreciation to Sweden for the continuing vision and inspiration, and to all the excellent speakers. On behalf of the European Union, I would like to say that we definitely listen extremely carefully and we walk the talk. We have made a special effort in bringing together a new, enhanced, and forward-looking, quite ambitious new strategy on women, peace, and security, a new action plan to which we invite all to share, and you're most welcome to join. We very much look forward to engaging more with states, but also with the United Nations and other regional organizations. We aspire by the principle that effective multilateralism is not for the faint at heart. It needs a lot of courage, it needs a lot of commitment, but also it needs a lot of enthusiasm to bring together all the relevant actors, including governments, including civil society, and of course, I would appreciate to listen to you on how would you see the role of regional organizations feed into the work, essentially in trying to help you implement and translate into concrete actions what you intend to do. And definitely the general principle is never again for us without us. Thank you.
I'd like to now invite to the floor Ms. Joanna Roper, Special Envoy on Gender Equality for the UK.
I feel this is a lineup of special envoys. I think I'm the fourth in the row. So I will try and keep this brief, but I'm here on, representing our Minister, Lord Ahmed, who couldn't be here today. First of all, thank you very much indeed for hosting the first symposium. I think this is really, really important. And as the UK holds the pen on women, peace and security, it's something that we are here, we are working with you and trying to work with partners to really drive forward this agenda as we approach the 20th anniversary. Because fundamentally, the UK, like many of us in this room, believe that you cannot secure peace without women at the heart of it. And I absolutely echo and commend everything that I have heard on the panel today. And the power of testimony is really, truly powerful. Just last week, I was in Nairobi for the Commonwealth Women Affairs Ministerial meeting. And on the sideline, we had Her Royal Highness, the Countess of Wessex, who has become our champion for women, peace and security and preventing sexual violence. And we heard for ourselves the testimony of women peacemakers, women negotiators who have been involved in negotiating peace. And as part of our Commonwealth Mediation Network, joining into the Global Alliance, launching tomorrow, we want to really make sure that we are supporting what you said, Your Excellency, the database of women who are able to take their position in negotiation. When I was in Afghanistan earlier this year, listening to the worries of women as their rights and were going to be rolled back, we need to make sure that women's voices are at the heart of all negotiations. And why do people fear women's roles? Because it might disrupt or complicate matters, that women's community experience just isn't relevant. We know that's not the case. So the UK stands firm on this agenda, whether it's contributing to the ELSI initiative that Canada launched last year, whether it's bringing together the Commonwealth women mediators, whether it's taking a look at our own mechanisms and holding a mirror up to our own deployed forces. And I'm pleased to say that we have just exceeded the UN target, but there's more that we need to do in that. So thank you very much for hosting this. The UK stands by to support, and we look forward to working with everybody as we celebrate the 20th anniversary next year. Thank you.
Next on my list, I have Mr. Marcos Gomez, Director General for UN and Human Rights of Spain.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you also to Sweden for convening us today. Well, implementation, that's the key word, I think. How do we implement? Because we all agree, the analysis is made. So let's move forward. Spain launched, during the last presidency in the Security Council, the network of focal points for women, peace and security matters. And I think it's proven a useful tool to progress this agenda. And now we are launching a new initiative together with our Finnish friends. We are launching Commitment 2025. It was announced yesterday by our Prime Minister in his speech to the GA. Together with the UN and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, we have identified a list of 10 ambitious commitments to be assumed by states and 5 asks to the UN system. These commitments are both political and operational. They include financing and capacity building specific actions. As political engagements, we call on states to nominate women in senior positions and require the participation of women in all the delegations to peace negotiations. We are aware that progress cannot be achieved without sustainable financing instruments, and we therefore include financial support to negotiating parties with meaningful participation of women, advocate for increased ODA devoted to this goal, and fund initiatives that support both formal and informal consultations that enable effective participations. Of course, we don't forget the crucial role of civil society, women's organizations, and mediators networks in this transformative change. But not only states must engage in this goal, the United Nations is crucial, and therefore we call on the UN to carry out specific actions that guarantee that peace and mediation structures are gender sensitive and respond to reality on the ground. In 2022, we will present a follow-up midterm report of the achievements that we reach on this commitment. And I would like to invite all the states present here today to join us in this commitment. We already have on board Namibia, Norway, Uruguay, Germany, the UK, Belgium, and Bulgaria. So it's good company for us all. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I have one more person on my list, and then if you don't mind, I want to try to take at least a couple from the floor, and then we'll come back for final remarks from the panel in the last minutes. Please, so I have, I'd like to invite Ms. Irene Khan, Director General of the International Development Law Organization. Yes, please.
First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for the courage and candor with which they have made the presentations, but also with which they are fighting for women, peace, and security. I am head of an organization called the International Development Law Organization, an intergovernmental organization of which Sweden and Sudan are members, which actually works on the ground to promote the rule of law and access to justice in many post-conflict, conflict-affected countries. And the question I would have for the panelists is, what do you see as the relationship between justice and peace when it comes to women? Because our experience on the ground shows that if you're talking about peace for women, you have to also talk about justice for women and women's leadership in the justice sector. Madame Di Carlo mentioned Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have been working over the last decade to develop elimination of violence against women units, prosecution units with women prosecutors, women judges, women defense lawyers working for women. In Liberia, we're working to professionalize or to bring women into the police sector. These are extremely important sectors when it comes to talking about peace. It is not only the mediators around the table, it is these institutions that actually build confidence in the peace process, and women have to play a leading role in it. The legal empowerment of women have put gender issues on the peacemaking agenda. Kenya is a great example where the women's movement actually influenced the drafting of the 2010 constitution, which then led to enormous legal changes. And my organization has helped to implement some of those laws, for example, on matrimonial property and on participation of women in the public sector. So there are many, many good examples of how women's role, enhanced role in the justice sector can actually promote a women's role in peace and security, and also not just in institutions, but also at the informal level with informal justice institutions, for example, in Somalia, in restorative justice processes. So I would very much want to highlight and request you to think about this area that is underrepresented, under-highlighted, and yet where women can play a huge role, and particularly to Sweden, which has been a trailblazer on feminist foreign policies. May I also suggest and encourage you and hope to work with you to set a feminist rule of law approach, because justice has to be feminized. gendered peace is also requires justice. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm being tremendously unfair to our panelists because there's a lot on the table to respond to, but this agenda is about inclusion, so I feel I do need to get at least a couple of very brief questions from the floor. One sentence, no semicolons or anything like that. Just really quickly, I've got a high hand right there, and then to the left, and then yeah. Mm-hmm. You won't be heard from the webcast if you don't mind, just quickly, and then the second, maybe you can come and line up and yeah, real brief if you don't mind.
Yeah,
please.
my name's Nicola. I work for Crisis Action, and we exist to build coalitions to protect people from war, and are grateful for the support of the government of Sweden. Personally, of course, the individual leadership of each of you to speak so powerfully, whether it's talking about how conflict rends on people's bodies, women's bodies, as much as our lives, is very powerful. The question here is, we know every challenge that we face as a world is how do we work together? And I wonder if each of the distinguished panelists would share your reflections of how can we best collaborate and support each other to achieve the goals. Practical examples from your experience of how we can be more collaborative and coalition building in making real change in
Great.
women's leadership for peace.
Perfect,
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nina Lahoud, International Legal Assistance Consortium Board and former long-term UN staff member. Thanks for the frankness and candor of everyone on the challenges that still confront us 20 years later, and the focus on non-implementation of so many Security Council commitments. On that, I wanted to focus under Spain's leadership. 2242 was adopted in the Council, the successor resolution of 1325 in October 2015, with many unimplemented obligations. And I wanted to focus on one in particular.
Focus, just quick question,
Yeah.
right? This is a quick question.
Okay.
To the point, you have about 15 seconds.
Which requires gender expertise and gender perspectives to be included in all assessment missions and planning efforts. The UN uses the strategic reviews as the framework for assessments, but many know that women's perspectives and participation are not included. So I wanted to ask in particular, this is critical because they connect with the women on the ground to get their input at a very critical stage in the planning and assessment. So I wanted to ask USG DiCarlo what she thinks about this and how can that be better implemented. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to come back to the panel. We've got about a minute, 30 seconds each, quickly. Maybe if you could, 30 seconds, and then we'll come down the line so the ministers can have the final word.
Thank you. I heard just a couple of questions. There were more interesting comments, which I really appreciated. Maybe just one point to make on the relationship between access to justice and peace. This is something that a lot of our civil society colleagues, most recently, in fact, from Somalia, raise. There's always a tension between peace and justice. What we find is that, at least at the Security Council and at the international level, there's a lot of emphasis on accountability. But what we believe is that you can't have accountability alone. We need to have a more holistic approach to what accountability actually looks like. And in order for women in these conflict countries to actually access justice, there's many steps that need to happen before that. You need to go back and address the root causes of conflict again. You need to address gender inequality. You need to address economic empowerment of women. So I think thinking about these issues in a much more integrated approach is the only way that you'll be able to bridge that divide. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much.
I just take the question about gender expertise in assessments and planning. This is part of our new policy to ensure that there is gender expertise when we're starting up a mission, when we're transitioning, for example, from a peacekeeping operation to a political mission, as we're doing in Haiti, and when we're developing regional strategies. Just to make the point, though, having gender expertise, the gender perspective, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a female in the delegation who's doing it. We have a lot of men who are working on this issue as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Excellency, please.
I'd like to thank everyone here. It has been a very enlightening experience for me to learn about what's going on in the various fields, and I'm sure that we are going to We are just starting, and we make use of any information that we get, and I'm sure that we will, at the end, we'll come up with a system, an all-inclusive system, taking into consideration all women's rights in peace and security and all the other issues. Thank you very much.
I'd like to join my colleague in thanking everybody. I thought the comments were really useful, and I would like to reflect on some of them in terms of looking at our practice. One of the features of South Africa's contribution to peacemaking is that we have one of the largest contingents of women peacekeepers deployed in different parts of the world, and that's been a significant contribution by South Africa. But what has had to accompany it is training of peacekeepers, because the assumption that because you're a woman, issues of gender equity are at the forefront of your thinking is a wrong assumption. So I think even with peace and justice, we've had transformation of the judiciary as a significant agenda post-apartheid, but we've had to do a lot of work on issues of gender and recognizing gender as a very important component of justice and lawmaking. So our lesson really is don't make assumptions about human rights and about recognition of the need to actively pursue the rights of all. It should be something that is at the forefront of our legislative processes as well as resource allocation. We partner with many organs of civil society, non-governmental organizations, as well as community-based organizations in our country. And our training program, both for peacekeeping as well as conflict mediation, includes my department, International Relations. It includes the police, the Defense Department of Military Veterans, Women's Affairs, Social Development, and I also wish to draw in education, because children are so affected by issues of conflict, and I think my colleagues there would be of great help. So it is a multi-sectoral focus, and we draw our strength from the experience and advice of non-governmental organizations. They really are the drivers of the programs that we run. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Minister Linda, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. Two comments. One from Ms. Khan about women in the justice sector, because I have to, since I used to be Vice Minister of Home Affairs, I also visited several of our police missions around, and we always wanted to have gender experts in the different missions. And there was a great difference if you had the gender expert on top. If you have an engagement from the absolute most senior person, then it could work. If you have the gender expert on the level as anybody inside the organization, it did not work. So I think as the situation is, one key issue is to put the gender expert on top, especially when it comes to the police forces, military forces, and so on. Then, of course, later on, it will be more equal. And that's why I don't believe in all or nothing plans. I think we have to take step by step. And for example, finally, when it comes to Yemen and Stockholm, yes, you can say you didn't have the word women in the agreement, which is a very, very important agreement. But we invited women to the meeting. We had big delegations with women. The women talked to the foreign minister of Sweden, Margot Wallström. We brought the women's message into the discussions with all the actors that finally came with the Stockholm Declaration in Yemen. They got financial support also from UN Women. We also have now a Swedish woman working with Martin Griffiths, who has a special responsibility for including women. Then you can say, is that nothing? Because it's not all. And I would say, finally, I always choose to see the glass as half full instead of half empty. And I think that, unfortunately, is the way we have to go, because we will not get all at the same time. And I prefer to have something instead of nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So it just leaves it to me to thank everyone for being with us this morning for the inaugural Women, Peace, and Leadership Symposium. I think while at the same time we are clearly experiencing a pushback, a global pushback against women's rights, what is evident today is that this agenda has great support, and you can count on IPI to be following you as you advance this agenda. Thank you so much.